All right, hello everyone. My name's Matt Godwin, for those that don't know me. And the project here is called a computational analysis of solar radio bursts. So first, I just want to give a little bit of physical background and context for those that aren't familiar with what we're observing. Um, so as you probably know, the sun is a variable star. It has a magnetic field that flips polarity every 11 years approximately, and this defines what we call the solar cycle. During this cycle, the shifting magnetic fields of the sun sometimes create solar flares, which are ejections of matter and radiation. These flares generate radio waves via the movement of charged particles of the plasma through magnetic field. And these radio emissions can be detected by Earth-based radio telescopes. We call these emissions solar radio bursts, or just SRBs for short. So the goal of this project is to create and optimize a program that will automate the counting process for solar radio bursts while staying within reasonable accuracy. So normally in the past, we have humans just look through our single frequency radio data and try and spot and identify and count any bursts that they find. And the goal is to have the program do this for us. We also want to use the analyzed data from the program to gain a little bit more insight on some of the relationships between the low frequency emission activity, things like average intensity of the bursts, burst occurrence frequency, and then also how the occurrence of the burst relates to the intensity of said bursts. And by the way, throughout this presentation, I might mention burst frequency. And when I say that, I'm talking about the rate at which they occur, or the number of bursts that occur, not the wave frequency of the emissions. We're measuring at a constant bandwidth, so that's not really relevant right now. So our data set comes from Radio Jove antennae, observing again at the 20.1 megahertz band. For those that don't know, Radio Jove is a NASA project designed to get young scientists and the general public involved in astronomy research via radio observations of Jupiter, the sun, and more. So this is data from Radio Jove, the top two plots. So we have the 10.7 centimeter solar radio flux, and then also the sunspot number. And as you can see, there's a pretty clearly defined cycle here. It's kind of sinusoidal. And then the bottom plot here is the human counts for solar radio bursts. This data was collected by Travis Marlowe. And as you can see, the trends here follow nicely with the sunspot number and the solar radio flux here as well. So here's how the program itself works. You might not be able to read this flowchart, but I'm going to walk you through it here. So first, when you run the program, it asks for user input. You have to give it a file name or a folder name with multiple files for it to analyze. It asks for an analysis period, so what part of the day and how much of the day you want to analyze. And then it will also ask for some output methods, which are just based on user preference, like whether you want to save the data as like text files afterwards, stuff like that. So the first thing it does is it takes the data you give it and it smooths it via a rolling 10-point average. So it will average data points 1 through 10, then 2 through 11, then 3 through 12, all the way through, and rolls it through the whole thing. And that helps smooth a lot of the like spikier interference that shows up. And then also it subsamples the data. So it actually only takes every 10th data point to actually analyze. And this works out in our favor because for one, the data is represented by about 10 data points per second. So we get about 1 data point per second instead, which cuts down the file size and the computation time by a whole order of 10. And then also, any trends that we're interested in observing, like these bursts, are going to be lasting more than a second. So anything that's happening sub 1 second, we're not really interested in anyway. So this kind of works out for us. The program will find an average value for the galactic background for the day, which is what we see if it's all quiet. And it uses that to compare to some of the burst values it might find. It uses 3 main parameters to check for bursts. The first is its intensity above the background value that it found. So if it finds a point that's at least 150% above the background, then it's going to say, okay, something's probably going on here. Let's check this out. The reason we came to 150% is because the average background sits around, I would say, the 10 to the 4th range, maybe the upper half of it, and the burst usually are 10 to the 5th or greater. So this value of 150%. Oh, by the way, that's in Kelvin. That's in temperature intensities. And so this value of 150% gets us in that range with a little bit of breathing room as well. It will then check to see if the total duration between the positive slope before the peak and the negative slope after the peak is at least 4 seconds. If it's shorter than that, it's probably an interference spike. Bursts can technically be longer than that, so that's why we check for it just being greater than that amount. And then it also does a little bit of slope analysis, so it checks to make sure that the possible burst isn't too spiky, because if it is, it's probably interference. If it's not steep enough, then it's probably just some random deviation in the background or something like that. So it checks through all three, and if something it's considering as a burst makes it through all three of those checks, then it will count it as a burst. It'll go through all the data you give it, and then it will output that via your preference. So one of the difficulties is because of their ability to be extremely similar to solar radio bursts, interference spikes can lead to some false positives in the program. So like you see here on the left, this is a solar radio burst. And then on the right here is an interference spike. Now, this particular interference spike would probably meet the requirements for the intensity. It would probably meet the requirements for the slope because it's got the right shape. But you might not be able to read that x-axis, but this is lasting less than a second. So this is very short, and so it wouldn't make it through that. So that's why we do multiple variables. So it has to make it through all of them to filter out things like this that might look like bursts. Currently, the program is found to be at about 10% error, and that error is relative to what we're calling expert human counts. These are our true control counts. And it's a weighted error because we weight the error of each day towards its contribution to the data pool. So we essentially just multiply it by the ratio of the counts of that day over the total counts of the data set. Reason we do that is because if we don't, some of the error values get kind of artificially inflated. For example, if the program counts 4 counts in a day and the control count is 1, that's a 300% error. But in reality, when one day can include hundreds of counts, a program count of 4 versus a control count of 1 is actually something we'd be pretty happy with. That's pretty close. And that would imply a low count number for the day. So we use this weighting to kind of mitigate that error inflation. And just for reference, the average error on non-expert humans counting this is around 15%. So as of now, the program is actually performing slightly better than average non-expert human counts. So onto our results here. This plot here shows our monthly average burst counts from the program versus time. And as you can see, it shows a nice sinusoidal nature like we'd expect from a solar cycle. You'll see a few gaps in the data here. These are due to some kind of random calibration and sample size complications. And these gaps in the data are actually carried forward through all the following plots, but past this one, we don't express them as gaps. The dots are just connected, so it's for easier viewing. Here's that same data plotted alongside the sunspot number, like seen in the Jove plot before. So as you can see, it follows these trends here fairly well, aside for a dip right here where the sunspot number is at its second maximum, and the count number falls quite low. This is quite interesting, and we hope that this gets investigated in the future to find out whether this is just some random undercounting of the program or if it's actually some deviation in low frequency emission activity, which would be very interesting. The lines of best fit you see here are Gaussians with a roughly 10-month average period, just for reference. Here is the average intensity of the bursts, a monthly average again, plotted against time. And a pretty low correlation coefficient here, an R-squared value of 0.15 would imply no correlation between the intensity of the bursts and their position within the cycle. However, this could be skewed by some assumptions made in the observation process. So Jove antennae measure intensity based off of antenna temperature, which assumes that the radiating body is a perfect black body, thermal emission, radiating isotropically. But the bursts we're observing are created by a non-thermal process, and they are anisotropic. So in the future, we think converting these intensity values to flux densities instead would be probably a better way of gaining more insight on that relationship. And by the way, the intensity values hold about a 10% error based off of the calibration methods of Jove receivers. That error value doesn't really affect this determination much. So here are the intensity of the burst plotted alongside their occurrence frequency. So again, a very, very low correlation coefficient, R-squared value of 0.05 implies no correlation here. There's a little bit of wiggle room in that line of best fit because again, you have that about 10% intensity error and then about a 10% count error as well. Yeah, but we're pretty confident that there's no correlation here. So to summarize, we found that the program analyzes large pools of data as intended with reasonable accuracy and speed. The program's output reflects previously known trends in the past solar cycle. The program also gives us the ability to measure peak intensity values of the burst as well, which is not something we did previously. So we have access to a whole other list of data now that we can work with. No correlation was found between the average intensity values of the bursts and their position within the cycle. And also no correlation was found between the intensity of the bursts and the rate at which they occur. Possible future work for the project could include some minor bug fixes and code optimization. We would like to, at some point, tie in the thesis work of Shelby Little, who to optimize the background determination method. She did a very nice quiet day curve, which gives us a really good range of values for what the galactic background could be. So finding some way to tie that in and compare those values to ours would be excellent. We want to investigate some of the discrepancies between the program's output and the sunspot number, like that spot I mentioned where the count went quite low while the sunspot number was at a maximum. That should be interesting. And then also, like I mentioned, we want to convert our intensity measurements into flux densities and then compare those with some of the known values of the solar cycle, like the 10.7 centimeter radial flux and the solar flare number, which both correlate well with the cycle. Couple acknowledgements here. I want to thank Dr. Higgins for his continuous support as my advisor. I want to thank Ms. Beverly Warner, whose prior thesis work on this program made this project possible. She created the kind of skeletal structure of the program. I want to thank Travis Marlowe for his extensive work on the human counts, and then also the other contributors to the rated Jove data pool, which would be Dr. Higgins, Dave Topinski, Wes Greenman, and Jim Brown. Thanks.
All right, let's thank Matt. Thanks, Jeff.